The morning mist rose from Magnolia Creek's dark waters, like the ghosts of secrets too terrible for daylight, carrying whispers of betrayal that would soon shatter the careful facade of respectability that Louisiana's plantation society had constructed around its most profitable sins. On March 17, 1852, as New Orleans slave markets prepared for their weekly human auctions, a carriage bearing the seal of one of Louisiana's most prestigious Creole families wound its way through the cypress-lined avenue toward a destiny that would expose the hideous complexity of racial hierarchy in a world where blood quantum determined not only social status, but survival itself. Inside that carriage sat Céleste Bourdelon, a woman whose café au lait complexion and refined features marked her as one of Louisiana's gens de couleur libres, the free people of color who occupied the precarious space between slavery and full citizenship in a society that measured human worth in fractions of African ancestry. But the documents clutched in her gloved hands told a story that would destroy everything polite society believed about the moral boundaries that separated the civilized from the savage, the protected from the expendable, the sacred bonds of motherhood from the cold calculations of commerce. For Céleste was not traveling to New Orleans as a victim of the slave trade, but as its willing architect. The papers she carried were bills of sale for 17 human beings, whose mixed-race heritage made them particularly valuable in markets that specialized in what traders euphemistically called fancy girls and house servants, enslaved people whose lighter skin and European features commanded premium prices from buyers who valued appearance over humanity. What made this transaction different from the thousands of similar sales that occurred throughout the antebellum South was that every person listed in those documents shared Céleste's blood, carried her genetic heritage, and bore the physical evidence of a family tree whose roots reached deep into the swampy moral ground where love and exploitation had become impossible to distinguish. Before we dive into this shocking story of ultimate betrayal, be sure to like, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and tell us where you're watching this video from, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about plantation society and family loyalty. The story of Céleste Bourdelon began 34 years earlier in the complex racial landscape of colonial Louisiana, where French and Spanish legal traditions had created opportunities for mixed-race individuals to achieve social mobility impossible in other American slave societies. Born in 1818 to Marie-Thérèse Bourdelon, herself the daughter of a French planter and his African concubine, Céleste represented the third generation of a family that had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of Louisiana's three-tiered racial hierarchy through strategic partnerships, careful accumulation of property, and ruthless exploitation of their ambiguous social position. Her mother, Marie-Thérèse, had been the placée of Auguste Trem, a wealthy sugar planter whose legitimate white family lived in the grand mansion on Magnolia Creek Plantation, while she occupied an elegant cottage in New Orleans' Faubourg Treme district. The plaçage system, that peculiar Louisiana institution that formalized relationships between white men and free women of color, provided Marie-Thérèse with financial security, social respectability within her community, and most importantly, legal freedom for her children that no amount of African ancestry could revoke under Louisiana's complex racial laws. Céleste had inherited not only her mother's beauty and intelligence, but her understanding of how to transform racial ambiguity into economic advantage in a society that was simultaneously obsessed with racial purity and utterly dependent on racial mixing for its continued prosperity. By her 20th birthday, she had established herself as one of New Orleans' most sought-after placés, her salon attracting not only wealthy white patrons, but some of the city's most influential free men of color, merchants, artisans, and property owners, whose success demonstrated that the right combination of skill, luck, and moral flexibility could create wealth even within the constraints of a system designed to limit their opportunities. But it was Céleste's relationship with her own children that revealed the true depths of moral corruption that the plaçage system could produce in those who mastered its intricacies. Over 15 years, she had borne children to 3 different white men, plantation owners, merchants, and professionals, who valued her discretion as much as her companionship. Some of these children had been recognized and provided for by their fathers, receiving educations, property, and legal protections that secured their positions in Louisiana's free-colored community. Others, however, particularly those whose fathers had moved on to marriage with white women or had died without making legal provisions, found themselves in more precarious circumstances that tested their mother's commitment to their welfare. Magnolia Creek Plantation itself represented everything that was magnificent and monstrous about Louisiana's sugar empire. Stretching across 5,000 acres of the richest alluvial soil the Mississippi River had ever deposited, its fields produced cane so sweet and abundant that a single harvest could generate enough profit to purchase 50 prime field hands at New Orleans slave markets. The plantation house rose from manicured grounds like a temple to Creole prosperity, its galleries supported by columns carved from cypress trees that had witnessed centuries of human suffering, while Spanish moss draped the structure like nature's own funeral shrouds. The current master of Magnolia Creek was Octave Thibodeau, Celeste's most recent and most generous patron, a man whose legitimate wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with a motherless daughter and an empty mansion that Celeste had gradually transformed into something approaching a home. Their relationship had evolved beyond the typical placage arrangement into something that resembled marriage in all but legal recognition. She managed his household, entertained his guests, and bore him 3 children who played in the same gardens where enslaved children labored from dawn until dusk. But even this seemingly stable arrangement carried within it the seeds of the betrayal that would shock Louisiana society to its foundations. For Octave's financial situation had deteriorated dramatically following a series of crop failures, bad investments, and the kind of gambling losses that could destroy even the wealthiest planter families when luck turned sour and creditors demanded immediate payment. By early 1852, Magnolia Creek faced the kind of financial crisis that typically resulted in the sale of land, livestock, and human property to satisfy debts that threatened to reduce proud plantation families to genteel poverty. The peculiar tragedy of Celeste's situation was that Louisiana law provided no legal protections for relationships like theirs, no matter how long they had endured or how many children they had produced. She was not Octave's wife in the eyes of the law, her children were not his legal heirs, and the property she had helped accumulate through her management and counsel could be disposed of without her consent to satisfy debts she had played no role in creating. When bankruptcy loomed, she faced the same vulnerability that had stalked free people of color throughout Louisiana's history, the knowledge that their freedom, security, and family bonds existed only at the pleasure of white patrons whose circumstances could change without warning. The slave quarters at Magnolia Creek housed 247 enslaved people whose lives were measured in sugar production and market value, rather than human dignity or family connections. Among them were several individuals whose lighter skin and refined features marked them as the children of previous relationships between plantation owners and enslaved women, products of the sexual exploitation that was as fundamental to plantation operations as crop rotation or weather prediction. These mixed-race enslaved people occupied a unique position in plantation society, valuable enough to command premium prices if sold, skilled enough to perform specialized tasks that increased their worth, yet vulnerable enough to serve as reminders to free people of color about how easily their own circumstances could change. The moral landscape that had shaped Celeste's worldview was one where survival required constant calculation of competing loyalties, where family bonds competed with financial necessity, where love battled against the cold logic of a society that treated human beings as commodities whose value fluctuated according to market conditions beyond their control. She had learned from childhood that mixed-race heritage was simultaneously a blessing and a curse, providing opportunities for advancement while creating vulnerabilities that pure European or African ancestry did not carry. Her children represented the full spectrum of these possibilities and dangers. The oldest, 17-year-old Marguerite, had inherited enough of her grandmother's French features to pass for white in communities where her heritage was unknown, creating opportunities for escape from Louisiana's racial restrictions if she was willing to abandon her family and identity forever. The youngest, 8-year-old Philippe, showed more obvious signs of African ancestry that would forever mark him as colored, regardless of his education, wealth, or accomplishments. Between these extremes were her other children and relatives, cousins, nieces, nephews, and half-siblings, whose varying degrees of mixed heritage created a living spectrum of Louisiana's racial complexity. Some could claim free status through maternal inheritance. Others faced the constant threat of being challenged on their legal standing by whites who coveted their property or positions. All of them understood that their survival depended on navigating a system that could transform them from protected family members into valuable commodities based on legal technicalities or economic pressures that operated beyond their control. The crisis that would transform Celeste from protective matriarch into willing participant in human trafficking began with a conversation that took place in Magnolia Creek's main parlor on a February evening when Louisiana's winter chill made the house's fireplaces inadequate against the psychological cold that was settling over the plantation's financial future. Octave had returned from meetings with his creditors, carrying news that would force decisions no moral person should ever face. The choice between financial ruin that would destroy his white daughter's future and actions that would preserve his legacy through the sacrifice of those who trusted him most completely. The numbers were stark and unavoidable. Magnolia Creek owed $47,000 to various creditors, a sum that exceeded the plantation's current assets by nearly half, unless drastic measures were taken to liquidate valuable property quickly and efficiently. Traditional solutions, selling land, equipment, or common field hands, would not generate sufficient capital quickly enough to avoid foreclosure proceedings that would destroy not only Octave's reputation, but his daughter's prospects for marriage into the kind of family that could maintain their social position. But there was another category of assets whose value had been appreciating steadily as New Orleans markets developed increasingly sophisticated tastes for enslaved people who could serve dual functions as domestic servants and sexual companions for wealthy men who preferred their human property to possess European features alongside African compliance. The mixed-race individuals connected to Magnolia Creek, whether through family relationships with Celeste or through the plantation's history of sexual exploitation, represented potential capital that could solve the financial crisis while satisfying market demands that made such sales both profitable and relatively discreet. The moral calculus that led to Celeste's ultimate decision involved considerations that revealed the psychological devastation that slavery inflicted, even on those who seemed to benefit from their proximity to power and wealth. She had spent decades accumulating property, influence, and security within a system that treated all people of African descent as fundamentally disposable, regardless of their individual circumstances or achievements. Her success had been built on her ability to make herself valuable to white patrons while maintaining emotional distance from the suffering of enslaved people whose labor generated the wealth that supported her comfortable lifestyle. But the choice she now faced exposed the fundamental truth about her position in Louisiana society, that her freedom, security, and family bonds existed only at the pleasure of white men, whose economic interests would always supersede personal relationships when genuine crises demanded difficult decisions. She could preserve her own status and protect some of her children by sacrificing others, or she could risk everything in futile resistance to forces that had been destroying families of color for generations without regard for moral principles or maternal bonds. The transformation of loving mother into calculated betrayer did not occur overnight, but unfolded through a series of smaller compromises and rationalizations that demonstrated how completely the logic of slavery could corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships when survival was at stake. Celeste began by identifying family members whose sale would create the least personal pain while generating the maximum financial return. Distant cousins whose relationships were more obligation than affection, half-siblings whose fathers had never acknowledged them, and children whose own circumstances made their futures precarious regardless of her actions. As February turned into March, and creditors' deadlines approached with the inevitability of natural law, the list of potential sales grew longer and more painful until it included some of her own children, those whose mixed heritage made them particularly valuable in markets that specialized in human beings whose appearance could satisfy white fantasies about racial superiority, while their legal status ensured complete subjugation to their owner's will. The fact that these sales would separate families and destroy lives became secondary to the mathematical certainty that they would preserve Magnolia Creek for Octave's legitimate daughter, while securing Celeste's own position as the woman who had saved his family's legacy through her willingness to sacrifice her own. The transformation of Celeste Bordelon from protective matriarch into willing architect of her family's destruction began with a ledger book that Octave placed on the mahogany desk in Magnolia Creek's library on the morning of March 3, 1852. The leather-bound volume contained more than financial records. It held the carefully calculated market values of every person of mixed-race heritage connected to their household, their skills assessed with the same cold precision that plantation owners use to evaluate livestock or agricultural equipment. Each entry reduced human beings who shared Celeste's blood to columns of numbers that measured their worth according to age, appearance, fertility, and the peculiar sexual appeal that New Orleans markets attached to enslaved people, whose European features could satisfy white fantasies, while their legal status ensured complete submission. The list was horrifyingly comprehensive, revealing the extent to which Octave had been planning this solution to his financial crisis, while maintaining the facade of loving partnership with the woman whose family he now proposed to sacrifice. Marguerite, Celeste's 17-year-old daughter, was valued at $2,300 based on her light complexion and virginity. Premium prices that reflected market demand for young women who could serve dual functions as domestic servants and sexual companions for wealthy buyers who preferred their human property to possess refined appearances. Alongside African compliance, Philippe, at only 8 years old, commanded $100 due to his mixed heritage and potential for training in skilled household positions that made such children valuable long-term investments. But the ledger's most shocking entries concerned family members whom Celeste had spent years protecting through careful manipulation of Louisiana's complex racial laws and social customs. Her cousin Beatrice, a talented seamstress whose free status had been carefully documented through multiple legal procedures, was listed at $1,800 despite her legally protected position. Her half-brother Lucien, a skilled carpenter who owned property in New Orleans' Faubourg-Marigny district, appeared with a valuation of $100 that assumed his free papers could be challenged or declared invalid through legal maneuvers that wealthy whites routinely employed to acquire valuable skilled workers without paying fair market prices. The psychological impact of seeing her loved ones reduced to commodity assessments struck Celeste with force that nearly caused physical collapse, but the financial mathematics were undeniably compelling. The total value represented by her family members exceeded $28,000, more than half the debt that threatened to destroy Magnolia Creek, while preserving enough assets to maintain the plantation's operations and secure the future of Octave's legitimate white daughter. The cold logic was inescapable. 17 lives could be sacrificed to preserve the comfort and social position of those whose survival mattered more according to the racial hierarchies that governed Louisiana society. Octave's presentation of this solution was masterfully crafted to exploit Celeste's deepest fears, while offering her rationalizations that might preserve her sanity through the moral compromises he was demanding. He reminded her that her own position depended entirely on his continued prosperity, that bankruptcy would reduce her to the same precarious circumstances that faced free people of color throughout Louisiana, when their white protectors could no longer afford to maintain their relationships. Her younger children would face uncertain futures without the financial security that Magnolia Creek could provide, while her oldest daughter might be forced into relationships with men who would treat her as badly as any enslaved woman if economic desperation eliminated her ability to choose her circumstances. The alternatives he presented were designed to demonstrate that resistance would only result in greater suffering for everyone involved. Bankruptcy would mean the sale of the entire plantation, including all enslaved people, but without the careful selection and placement that Celeste's cooperation could ensure. Her family members would be sold to unknown buyers who might transport them to distant states where they would face harsher conditions and have no hope of eventual reunion with surviving relatives. By participating in their sale, she could at least influence their destinations and ensure they were purchased by buyers who would treat them relatively well by the standards of an institution that recognized no moral constraints on human exploitation. The weeks that followed this initial conversation revealed the systematic way that Celeste had been prepared for this moment through years of subtle moral conditioning that had gradually accustomed her to viewing human relationships through the lens of economic calculation. Her success in Louisiana's placage system had required constant evaluation of competing loyalties, strategic decisions about which family members deserved protection and which could be sacrificed to preserve her position with white patrons whose support determined her survival and prosperity. She had learned to rationalize the suffering of enslaved people whose labor supported her comfortable lifestyle by focusing on her own vulnerability as a free woman of color whose legal status provided no genuine security against white men who controlled the political and economic systems that governed Louisiana society. Her identification with the plantation elite, rather than with enslaved people who shared her African ancestry, had been reinforced through decades of social conditioning that taught mixed-race individuals to view their European heritage as more significant than their African blood when making decisions about identity and loyalty. The process of selecting which family members would be sacrificed revealed the full extent of psychological damage that slavery inflicted on those who occupied intermediate positions in its racial hierarchy. Celeste began with individuals whose relationships were more obligation than affection, distant cousins whose mixed heritage made them valuable, but whose emotional bonds were weak enough to make their sale psychologically tolerable. She justified these choices by emphasizing their youth and adaptability, convincing herself that they would adjust to enslaved status more easily than older family members who had grown accustomed to freedom. As the list expanded to include closer relatives, her rationalizations became more desperate and elaborate. Beatrice, despite her legal freedom and valuable skills, was described as too independent and likely to encounter difficulties with white authorities regardless of her status. Lucienne was characterized as having dangerous political ideas that might attract unwanted attention to the entire family if economic pressures forced him to express his views more publicly. Her own children were evaluated according to their prospects for success in white society, with those showing more obvious African features deemed less likely to achieve social mobility, and therefore better suited to the protection that skilled enslaved positions might provide. The moral infrastructure that supported these decisions was built on sophisticated self-deception that transformed betrayal into sacrifice and abandonment into protection. Celeste convinced herself that she was saving her family by ensuring their sale to carefully selected buyers, rather than allowing them to face the random cruelties of bankruptcy proceedings that would scatter them without regard for their individual needs or abilities. She emphasized the temporary nature of slavery, pointing to examples of enslaved people who had purchased their freedom or been manumitted by grateful owners as evidence that their current circumstances need not be permanent. Most importantly, she adopted the psychological framework that allowed white slave owners to maintain their sense of moral superiority while participating in systematic human exploitation. The belief that enslaved people were fundamentally different from free individuals and therefore capable of finding happiness and fulfillment in conditions that would be unbearable for those born to freedom. Her mixed-race family members were reconceptualized as naturally suited to enslaved status due to their African heritage, while their European ancestry was reinterpreted as providing them with advantages that would help them excel in their new circumstances. The actual process of preparing her family members for sale required elaborate deceptions that demonstrated Celeste's complete transformation from loving relative into calculating human trafficker. She began inviting targeted individuals to spend extended periods at Magnolia Creek, ostensibly to help with plantation management during Octave's financial difficulties, but actually to allow potential buyers to evaluate their skills and appearance without arousing suspicions about their ultimate fate. Family gatherings that had once been celebrations of their collective success in navigating Louisiana's racial complexities became opportunities for assessment and selection by men whose primary interest was determining which human beings would provide the best return on their investments. The children were told they would be traveling to visit relatives in other parishes, their excitement about these adventures carefully maintained through elaborate stories about the wonderful opportunities awaiting them in their new homes. Adult family members were informed about temporary employment opportunities that would help them contribute to the family's financial recovery while developing new skills that would enhance their value in Louisiana's competitive market for skilled free people of color. The lies were crafted with sufficient detail and plausibility to prevent questions that might have exposed the true nature of their circumstances until it was too late for resistance or escape. Marguerite, as the most valuable potential sale, received special attention designed to preserve her market worth while preventing her from understanding her mother's betrayal until the transaction was irreversible. She was told that a wealthy New Orleans family had requested her services as a governess for their children, a position that would provide excellent wages and opportunities to develop connections with Louisiana's social elite. The education and refinement that Celeste had provided through years of careful investment were now being used to enhance her daughter's appeal to buyers who valued intelligence and culture alongside physical beauty in their human property. The buyers themselves represented the full spectrum of white society's relationship with human bondage, from established plantation families seeking skilled house servants to New Orleans merchants who specialized in the sexual exploitation of enslaved women whose mixed heritage satisfied their particular preferences. Celeste met with each potential purchaser personally, evaluating their circumstances and intentions with the same care she had once used to select schools and marriage partners for these same family members. She convinced herself that her involvement in these negotiations demonstrated maternal concern rather than commercial calculation, that her ability to influence placement decisions proved she was protecting rather than destroying the people she claimed to love. The financial arrangements were structured to maximize both immediate payment and long-term security for Celeste's remaining household. Some sales were completed immediately with full cash payment that would be applied directly to Magnolia Creek's outstanding debts. Others involved extended payment plans that would provide ongoing income to support the plantation's operations, while buyers took immediate possession of their human property. Most significantly, several transactions included provisions for potential repurchase if future financial circumstances permitted, allowing Celeste to maintain the illusion that these separations might be temporary, despite the mathematical impossibility of generating sufficient wealth to reverse so many sales. The legal mechanisms that facilitated these transactions reveal the sophisticated infrastructure that Louisiana society had developed to support human trafficking while maintaining the appearance of moral respectability. Bills of sale were carefully drafted to establish clear ownership while minimizing paperwork that might create future complications for buyers who wanted to transport their new property to other states. Free papers belonging to legally protected individuals were either destroyed or transferred to buyers who would ensure they never surfaced to challenge their ownership claims. The moment of ultimate betrayal was approaching, but the psychological preparation had been so thorough that Celeste no longer recognized the monster she had become. How could a mother's love be so completely corrupted by a system designed to destroy human bonds? What do you think? Was there any possible justification for her actions? Or had slavery created a moral void that consumed even the most fundamental relationships? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story is shocking you as much as it shocked us. As March 17, 1852 approached and the day of reckoning arrived, Celeste found herself in the paradoxical position of having orchestrated her family's destruction while genuinely believing she had acted in their best interests, according to the twisted logic that slavery imposed on all participants in its machinery of human exploitation. The woman who had once been celebrated as a successful example of mixed-race achievement in Louisiana society had been transformed into an unwilling agent of the very system that threatened her own survival and that of everyone she claimed to love. The moral complexity of her situation reflected the broader corruption that slavery inflicted on American society, demonstrating how an institution based on human exploitation could pervert even the most fundamental relationships when survival required participation in systematic brutality. Celeste's betrayal of her own family was both personal tragedy and systemic inevitability, the logical result of conditions that made moral choice impossible when economic necessity demanded actions that violated every principle of human decency and maternal obligation. The morning of March 17, 1852, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that Louisiana rarely experienced, as if the atmosphere itself had been purified to witness events that would expose the moral bankruptcy at the heart of American civilization. The mist that usually shrouded Magnolia Creek's waters had lifted completely, revealing every detail of the landscape with surgical precision: the Spanish moss that draped ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, the perfectly manicured gardens where enslaved hands maintained beauty built on human suffering, and the gleaming carriages that wound their way up the plantation drive, carrying buyers whose wealth had been accumulated through the systematic exploitation of human beings whose only crime was possessing darker skin than their oppressors. Celeste Bordelon stood on the gallery of Magnolia Creek's main house, her silk dress rustling in morning breezes that carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and the distant sound of children's laughter from quarters where enslaved families enjoyed their final moments together before the machinery of human trafficking scattered them across Louisiana like seeds thrown to barren ground. In her hands, she clutched the leather portfolio containing bills of sale for 17 human beings whose mixed-race heritage made them particularly valuable in markets that specialized in what traders euphemistically called fancy servants, people whose European features could satisfy white fantasies, while their legal status ensured complete subjugation to their owner's will. The assembled buyers represented the full spectrum of Louisiana's slave-owning elite, each drawn to Magnolia Creek by carefully worded advertisements that had circulated through networks of human traffickers who understood the premium prices that mixed-race individuals commanded in sophisticated markets. Auguste Martineau, owner of 3 sugar plantations in Lafourche Parish, had traveled over 100 miles specifically to evaluate Marguerite, whose combination of youth, beauty, and education made her ideal for the dual roles of house servant and sexual companion that wealthy planters expected from their most valuable human property. Dr. Etienne Boudreau, a New Orleans physician whose medical practice provided convenient cover for his involvement in the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, examined the assembled family members with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating livestock for breeding purposes. His particular interest in children reflected market demand from buyers who preferred to acquire human property at young ages when their capacity for resistance could be systematically destroyed through psychological conditioning that would ensure lifelong compliance with whatever demands their owners might impose. Most disturbing of all was the presence of Marie-Claire Dufresne, a wealthy widow whose own mixed-race heritage had not prevented her from becoming one of Louisiana's most successful human traffickers, specializing in the sale of light-skinned individuals whose ambiguous racial status made them valuable for buyers who wanted enslaved people capable of passing for white when circumstances required such deception. Her participation in the day's transactions demonstrated how completely the logic of slavery could corrupt even those who had themselves been victimized by its racial hierarchies. The viewing began at precisely 9 o'clock, with Celeste personally introducing each family member to potential buyers, while providing detailed information about their skills, health, and temperament with the same professional competence that livestock dealers used when marketing prize cattle or breeding horses. She described Marguerite's education and musical abilities, emphasized Beatrice's exceptional needlework skills, and highlighted Philippe's quick intelligence and capacity for learning the refined manners that made young mixed-race boys valuable as personal servants for wealthy families who wanted their human property to reflect their own sophistication and good taste. The most heartbreaking aspect of these presentations was the trust that her family members continued to show, even as they were being evaluated like merchandise by men whose intentions were obvious to everyone except those whose lives were being bartered for financial gain. Marguerite smiled politely as Auguste Martineau examined her teeth and felt her arms to assess her physical condition, still believing her mother's lies about employment opportunities that would advance her career and provide valuable experience working with Louisiana's social elite. Philippe chattered excitedly about the adventure he thought awaited him, his 8-year-old imagination transforming the terrifying reality of human trafficking into a wonderful journey to meet new friends and see places he had never visited before. His innocent questions about when he would see his mother again were met with reassuring lies that became more difficult to maintain as the morning progressed and buyers began making offers that would determine his fate for the remainder of his life. The negotiations themselves revealed the sophisticated market mechanisms that had evolved to support human trafficking while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business transactions. Prices were discussed with the same attention to detail that characterized any valuable commodity, with buyers comparing the relative merits of different individuals while sellers provided guarantees about health, temperament, and skills that would protect purchasers' investments. Payment terms were negotiated to accommodate buyers' financial circumstances while ensuring sellers received maximum value for their human property. Auguste Martineau's offer for Marguerite exceeded even Celeste's optimistic projections, his willingness to pay $2,800, reflecting both her exceptional beauty and his specific intentions for her use on his plantation. The price included provisions for her transportation to Lafourche Parish, basic clothing appropriate for her new status, and legal documentation that would establish his ownership beyond any future challenge. Most cynically, it included a clause allowing him to sell her to other buyers if she proved unsatisfactory for his purposes, ensuring his investment would retain its value regardless of how successfully she adapted to the sexual exploitation he clearly intended. Dr. Boudreau's interest focused on the younger family members, whose malleability made them ideal for the specialized training he provided through his New Orleans establishment. His purchases included not only Philippe, but 3 of Celeste's cousins, whose ages ranged from 10 to 14, their combined value reflecting his assessment of their potential for development into the kind of skilled, compliant servants that wealthy urban families preferred for their most intimate household needs. The legal formalities that accompanied each sale were conducted with meticulous attention to detail that demonstrated how completely Louisiana's judicial system had been structured to support human trafficking while protecting buyers' rights and investments. Bills of sale were drafted in duplicate, with witnesses present to prevent future disputes about ownership or the specific terms under which each individual had been transferred. Free papers belonging to legally protected family members were either destroyed or transferred to buyers, who would ensure they never surfaced to complicate ownership claims. Most tragically, several transactions included provisions that revealed the extent to which sexual exploitation was openly acknowledged as a primary motivation for these purchases. Marguerite's bill of sale specifically referenced her breeding potential and included clauses establishing Auguste Martineau's rights to any children she might bear while in his possession. Similar language appeared in documents covering other young women whose fertility was viewed as an additional source of future profit through the systematic rape that Louisiana law not only permitted but actively protected. The moment when Celeste's deception could no longer be maintained arrived as carriages were being loaded with their human cargo and family members finally understood the true nature of the day's transactions. Marguerite's scream of betrayal and disbelief echoed across Magnolia Creek's grounds like the cry of a wounded animal. Her desperate appeal to maternal bonds that no longer existed met with cold silence from the woman who had sold her into sexual slavery to preserve her own financial security. Philippe's childish confusion transformed into terror as he realized that the wonderful adventure his mother had promised was actually separation from everything he had ever known and everyone he had ever loved. His small hands reaching toward Celeste as he was lifted into Auguste Martineau's carriage created an image that would haunt the plantation's enslaved community for generations, visible proof that no relationship was sacred when economic necessity demanded the sacrifice of human bonds to preserve white wealth and privilege. The enslaved people who witnessed these scenes understood that they were observing something even more morally corrupt than the routine brutalities that characterized plantation life. The systematic exploitation of enslaved people by those who owned them was at least comprehensible according to the logic of property rights and racial hierarchy that governed Southern society. But the betrayal of family members by someone who shared their heritage and had once claimed to love them represented a level of moral corruption that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and the bonds that connected people across racial lines. Beatrice's attempt to resist her sale by producing legal documents proving her free status resulted in a confrontation that exposed the complete meaninglessness of such protections when wealthy whites decided to ignore them. Her papers were dismissed as forgeries despite their obvious authenticity, while her protests were characterized as evidence of the dangerous independence that made her unsuitable for free status in a society that expected grateful submission from all people of African descent, regardless of their legal circumstances. The loading of carriages continued throughout the morning, as families were systematically destroyed and human beings were transformed into portable assets that would generate profits for their new owners while serving as permanent reminders of the moral void at the heart of American civilization. Each departure was accompanied by scenes of grief and desperation that would have moved anyone possessed of basic human decency. But the buyers and sellers involved had long since abandoned such luxuries in favor of the cold calculations that made human trafficking both profitable and socially acceptable. Dr. Boudreau's carriage, loaded with 4 children whose futures would involve systematic sexual abuse disguised as domestic service, departed Magnolia Creek at precisely 11:30, with its human cargo weeping for mothers and siblings they would never see again. The physician's satisfaction with his purchases was evident in his generous payment and his willingness to recommend Celeste's services to other buyers who might require similar merchandise in the future. Auguste Martineau's departure with Marguerite marked the climax of the morning's moral catastrophe. Her muffled sobs from inside his carriage serving as soundtrack for a transaction that had transformed a beloved daughter into sexual property whose value would be measured in the children she would be forced to bear and the pleasure she would be required to provide for a man whose wealth had purchased the right to destroy her humanity. The final carriage to leave Magnolia Creek carried Marie-Claire Dufresne along with 3 of Celeste's adult relatives, whose skills made them valuable additions to her New Orleans trafficking operation. Their departure completed the dismantling of a family that had spent generations accumulating the education, property, and social connections that provided security in Louisiana's complex racial hierarchy, reducing decades of careful achievement to a single morning's commercial transactions. As the last carriage disappeared down Magnolia Creek's oak-lined drive, and silence settled over grounds that had witnessed one of the most systematic betrayals in Louisiana's history of family destruction, Celeste stood alone on the plantation gallery, counting money that represented not only the preservation of her remaining security, but the complete abandonment of every moral principle that had once defined her identity. The $31,400 she had received for her family members exceeded even Octave's most optimistic projections, ensuring Magnolia Creek's financial recovery while establishing her as one of Louisiana's most successful human traffickers. But the true cost of her actions extended far beyond the immediate suffering of those who had been sold into slavery by someone they had trusted absolutely. The enslaved community at Magnolia Creek understood that they had witnessed the complete moral collapse of someone who had once represented the possibility that mixed-race individuals could navigate Louisiana's racial hierarchies without abandoning their humanity. Celeste's transformation from protective matriarch into willing participant in human trafficking demonstrated that no one was immune to the corrupting influence of a system that measured human worth in market values and reduced family bonds to commercial calculations. The psychological impact on Celeste herself would become apparent in the weeks and months that followed, as the woman who had orchestrated her family's destruction discovered that financial security purchased through ultimate betrayal provided no protection against the spiritual devastation that accompanied such complete abandonment of moral principle. The money that had seemed so important when creditors threatened Magnolia Creek's survival would prove insufficient to purchase peace of mind or relief from the knowledge that she had become everything she had once despised about the system that had created the circumstances requiring such terrible choices. The decade that followed March 17, 1852, transformed Celeste Bourdillon from a woman who had once been celebrated as a successful example of mixed-race achievement into a living monument to the moral corruption that slavery inflicted on all who participated in its machinery of human exploitation. The $31,400 she had received for selling 17 family members had indeed saved Magnolia Creek from bankruptcy and secured her position as Octave Thibodeau's mistress. But the psychological cost of her betrayal proved far steeper than any financial debt could ever have demanded, from someone who retained even fragments of human conscience. By 1862, as the Civil War raged across Louisiana and the institution of slavery approached its long-overdue abolition, Celeste had aged in ways that transcended ordinary physical deterioration. Her once lustrous hair had turned completely white, not from the passage of years, but from the weight of guilt that no amount of luxury could alleviate. Her café au lait complexion had taken on the waxy pallor of someone who spent her days in darkened rooms, avoiding mirrors that might reflect the monster she had become, while her eyes held the peculiar emptiness that characterized people who had sacrificed their souls for temporal advantages that ultimately provided no genuine satisfaction. The wealth that had seemed so crucial when creditors threatened Magnolia Creek's survival had multiplied through investments and additional human trafficking operations that Celeste had established using her expertise in evaluating mixed-race individuals for sale to buyers who specialized in sexual exploitation. Her success in this hideous commerce had made her one of Louisiana's most profitable human traffickers, her reputation spreading through networks of slave traders who valued her ability to identify and prepare valuable human property for markets that demanded specific combinations of beauty, skill, and psychological vulnerability. But material prosperity could not protect her from the spiritual devastation that accompanied knowledge of what had become of the family members she had betrayed for financial gain. Reports filtered back to Magnolia Creek through the informal networks that connected Louisiana's enslaved communities, carrying news that transformed Celeste's comfortable lifestyle into a prolonged exercise in psychological torture that no amount of wealth or social position could ameliorate. Marguerite had died in childbirth at Auguste Martineau's plantation in 1856, her fourth pregnancy ending in complications that might have been treatable if proper medical care had been provided to enslaved women whose value was measured primarily in their reproductive capacity rather than their individual welfare. Her daughter had lived just long enough to understand that her mother's promises about employment opportunities had been lies designed to facilitate her sale into sexual slavery, her final words reportedly being a curse upon the woman who had traded maternal love for monetary profit. Philippe had lasted longer, his youthful resilience allowing him to survive the systematic abuse that Dr. Boudreau inflicted on children purchased for the sexual entertainment of wealthy New Orleans clients who paid premium prices for access to young victims whose mixed-race heritage satisfied their particular perversions. But psychological damage accumulated until his 15th birthday, when he attempted escape from the physician's establishment by throwing himself into the Mississippi River during a period when spring floods made drowning inevitable for anyone lacking the swimming skills that enslaved children were rarely permitted to develop. The adult family members had faced fates that varied according to their individual circumstances and the specific intentions of their purchasers, but none had escaped the fundamental horror of discovering that their legal freedom meant nothing when wealthy whites decided to ignore documentation that protected people whose market value exceeded the minor inconvenience of violating their civil rights. Beatrice had been transported to Texas, where her needlework skills were exploited by buyers who worked her 16 hours daily, producing garments that generated enormous profits, while she received only subsistence rations that barely sustained life. Lucien had been sold to Mississippi cotton planters who valued his carpentry expertise but had no interest in preserving his health beyond the minimum required to extract maximum labor from his skills before physical breakdown made him expendable. His letters, smuggled back to Louisiana through networks of enslaved people who risked severe punishment to maintain family connections, described working conditions so brutal that death would have been preferable to the prolonged agony of existence, under masters who viewed human beings as agricultural equipment to be used until mechanical failure made replacement more economical than repair. The psychological impact of these revelations on Celeste demonstrated that even the most complete moral corruption could not entirely eliminate human capacity for guilt and remorse when confronted with the full consequences of evil choices. She began experiencing symptoms that no amount of medical attention could address. Insomnia caused by dreams, filled with images of family members calling her name from slave quarters where they suffered torments she had made possible, headaches that felt like iron spikes being driven through her skull by the spirits of children who had died believing in her love until the moment of ultimate betrayal. Most disturbing were the hallucinations that began appearing with increasing frequency as news of her family's suffering reached Magnolia Creek through channels that connected Louisiana's enslaved communities across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. She reported seeing Marguerite standing in doorways with blood-stained dress and accusatory eyes, her ghost demanding explanations for maternal abandonment that had condemned an innocent daughter to death through systematic sexual exploitation. Philippe appeared as he had been at 8 years old, his childish voice asking why his mother had lied about the wonderful adventure that was actually separation from everything that had made existence meaningful. The enslaved community at Magnolia Creek observed these developments with the complex mixture of satisfaction and horror that accompanied any evidence that cosmic justice operated according to principles that transcended human law and social hierarchy. They understood that Celeste's psychological deterioration represented not merely personal punishment, but systemic correction of moral imbalances that had been allowed to persist too long without appropriate consequences. Her suffering served as visible reminder that no injustice could continue indefinitely without generating equal and opposite reactions that restored ethical equilibrium to a universe designed to support human dignity rather than systematic exploitation. But they also recognized that her individual torment, however appropriate as punishment for ultimate betrayal, could not address the fundamental evil of a system that had created circumstances, making such choices seem rational to someone whose survival depended on participation in human trafficking. Celeste's transformation from loving mother into willing architect of family destruction reflected the broader corruption that slavery inflicted on American society, demonstrating how institutions based on human exploitation could pervert even the most fundamental relationships when economic necessity demanded actions that violated every principle of moral decency. As the Civil War approached its climax and Union forces advanced through Louisiana parishes, systematically liberating enslaved communities while dismantling the economic infrastructure that had sustained plantation society for generations, Celeste faced the prospect that her carefully constructed world would collapse regardless of the financial sacrifices she had made to preserve it. The wealth accumulated through human trafficking would prove worthless if the entire system of slavery was abolished, while the social position she had fought to maintain would disappear when racial hierarchies that supported it were eliminated through military conquest and constitutional amendment. The final irony of her situation became apparent when Octave Thibodeau died suddenly in February 1863, his death from heart failure leaving Celeste without the white protection that had made her betrayal of family members seem necessary for survival. His will, carefully crafted to protect his legitimate white daughter's inheritance, made no provision for the mixed-race woman who had sacrificed everything to preserve his financial legacy, reducing her instantly from privileged mistress to vulnerable widow, whose legal status provided no protection against creditors who might challenge her right to remain at Magnolia Creek. The approaching Union occupation of Louisiana presented Celeste with choices that revealed the ultimate futility of her earlier betrayal. She could attempt to maintain her position as a wealthy woman of mixed-race heritage in a society that was rapidly abandoning the racial categories that had once provided opportunities for advancement, or she could acknowledge that the system she had served so effectively was collapsing and seek reconciliation with surviving family members whose forgiveness might provide spiritual redemption if not material security. But the news that reached her during the spring of 1863 made such reconciliation impossible. The final family members who had survived their enslavement were already dead, killed by wartime disruptions that made enslaved people expendable when their labor could no longer generate profits for owners who faced financial ruin. Marguerite was gone, Philippe was gone, and the others had died in circumstances that testified to the complete worthlessness of promises about humane treatment that had helped Celeste rationalize her participation in their sale. The liberation of Magnolia Creek by Union forces in May 1863 found Celeste alone in the plantation house, surrounded by wealth that had lost its meaning and luxury that provided no comfort against the knowledge that she had destroyed everyone she had once claimed to love in service of a cause that had ultimately proven futile. The enslaved people who chose to remain at the plantation after emancipation regarded her with mixtures of pity and disgust, understanding that her punishment had been more complete than anything legal authorities could have imposed for her crimes against human decency. Her final years were spent in increasing isolation as Louisiana's post-war society developed new racial categories that provided no comfortable position for someone whose wealth had been accumulated through systematic betrayal of her own heritage. The networks of mixed-race families that had once provided social support and economic opportunities rejected her participation, while white society viewed her with suspicion as someone whose knowledge of human trafficking operations might prove inconvenient if federal authorities decided to investigate wartime atrocities that had been committed under slavery's legal protection. Celeste Bordelon died on March 17, 1867, exactly 15 years after the morning when she had sold 17 family members to finance Magnolia Creek's preservation, in the same room where she had once counted money that represented her family's market value. Her death was attributed to natural causes by physicians who found no evidence of physical illness, but those who had witnessed her final years understood that she had simply reached the limits of what human consciousness could endure while carrying the weight of ultimate betrayal. Her funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen mourners, most of them former enslaved people who came not to pay respects but to witness the end of someone who had represented everything evil about the system that had finally been destroyed through military conquest. The minister who delivered her eulogy spoke carefully neutral words about divine mercy and eternal judgment, while avoiding any specific references to the actions that had made her one of Louisiana's most successful human traffickers and most complete moral failures. The estate she left behind was eventually distributed among creditors and distant relatives who had played no role in her trafficking operations. But the plantation house at Magnolia Creek stood empty for decades as testimony to the ultimate futility of wealth accumulated through systematic betrayal of human bonds. Local legends claimed that the building was haunted by the spirits of family members who had been sold into slavery by someone they had trusted absolutely. Their ghostly presence serving as permanent reminder that some debts accumulated interest across lifetimes until payment became inevitable, regardless of earthly circumstances. The broader significance of Celeste's story extended far beyond individual tragedy to encompass the systemic corruption that slavery had inflicted on American society at every level of racial hierarchy. Her transformation from protective matriarch into willing participant in human trafficking demonstrated that institutions based on human exploitation could pervert even the most fundamental relationships when survival required participation in systematic brutality disguised as economic necessity. But her fate also revealed that cosmic justice operated according to principles that transcended temporary legal protections for human bondage, ensuring that moral debts accumulated consequences that no amount of wealth or social position could prevent indefinitely. The woman who had sold her own blood for financial gain had discovered that some prices were too steep for human souls to pay, while retaining any connection to the moral universe that gave existence meaning beyond mere survival. Celeste Bordelon's story reveals the ultimate corruption that slavery inflicted not just on its direct victims, but on those who thought they could benefit from participating in its horrors. Her betrayal of 17 family members, including her own children, shows how a system based on human exploitation could destroy even the most sacred bonds when economic survival was at stake. This shocking tale from 1852, Louisiana exposes truths that many prefer to forget, that some people of mixed-race heritage became willing participants in human trafficking, that mothers could be driven to sell their own children, and that the moral corruption of slavery extended far beyond simple black and white categories. Was there any possible justification for Celeste's actions, or had slavery created moral voids that consumed even maternal love? What do you think about this ultimate betrayal? Could you ever forgive a mother who sold her own family to preserve her social position? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden complexities of America's darkest chapter. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're uncovering another shocking scandal from the antebellum South that will challenge everything you thought you knew about plantation society.